Hey, so welcome back to Foresight Paradigm. This is Paradigmatic Discussions number 12. We're going to be discussing the development of unorthodox ideas. I'm speaking with the author and translator, Kirk Watson. Hey, Mr. Watson, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. So I discovered you on Amazon. You have a page of, you have like many books that you've translated, I think mainly from French. And so you basically do the development of unorthodox ideas, like from atheism to pantheism to materialism to anarchism to communism. And yeah, I've discovered several books that I wanted to find that I couldn't find anywhere else, that you've translated. So kind of obscure works a lot of times. So I have a couple of them right here. This is one. It's Diderot's Skeptic's Walk, which is a book
Hmm.
that I really like a lot, that I've read about, that I haven't really been able to find anywhere else. And then another one is um, New Liberties in Thought. Du Marseille's kind of a clandestine manuscript. Uh,
Compilation.
yeah, that were really popular in like the early 1700s, I believe. Yeah, so Mr. Watson, how did you get into translating, get into this project that you have that you do?
Uh, it's really, I mean, the larger picture is that when I was a religious believer, I was really interested in discovering the history, how things developed, how the beliefs developed. And when I lost my beliefs, I just took the same kind of interest in the heritage and the background of the ideas that I now believed, uh, which there are certain kind of doctrines, or not dogmas, but basic kind of assumptions that come with modern atheism, which is determinism, materialism, you know, different views about what the soul might be, and that sort of thing. So there, and it just as I read my way backwards, there's a huge sort of heritage legacy of all of these ideas being developed for hundreds of years. So yeah, largely this is just me reading, discovering for myself, and then bringing it out for anyone else who wants to read it.
Now,
So
are you American, right? Or you,
yeah,
you live in America now? Okay. So have you like lived abroad? Because I know mainly it's French that you translate.
yeah. I've never lived in France, but my wife's from abroad, from the United Kingdom. So,
Okay,
uh,
cool.
but I'm just self-taught in French.
Excellent.
So,
Yeah, that I imagine that's a pretty cool job, being able to find all these, obscure books that are actually still important, and being able to bring them
yeah,
to a wider audience in English. Definitely.
yeah. My
Um,
my my professional background, like I'm trained in library science and archives. That's what I'm working.
okay, excellent. I know, speaking with the Enlightenment writer Philip Bloom months
Hmm.
ago, we were talking about how Diderot's letters to Sophie Volan. It'd be nice if there were some English translations of that. So I hope
Hmm.
maybe someday you're able to find those, and maybe do those. That would definitely be interesting. Or maybe the
Yeah.
Indiscreet Jewels, right? Where Diderot
Yes.
has the vagina that's talking, and like there's like an Arab court or something, and the female genitals are telling these stories. That might be interesting too.
Yeah. That's. I've looked at that one. There is an existing English translation. I think maybe on Google Books, but yeah. There's plenty of more to do with Diderot. It, he's one of the
Yeah,
better ones that sell better, so he's always attractive in that way.
wonderful. Well, let's get into like specific ideas and their history. Let's start with pantheism. So, can you tell me kind of the development of pantheism, where we first see that, and the historical record, and how that developed?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't have a sort of specialization to go back too far, but in the kind of early modern times, where I most know the most and could talk the most, is you have a, let's see, with the Renaissance and the rediscovery of all these old texts, they're reading a lot of the old Stoics, and I think the notion from the sort of the most of the modern Western pantheism comes from Stoics, such as there's a pretty clear statement, sounds very pantheistic, in Seneca, in one of his books, and that almost gets quoted verbatim, the God or nature sort of statement.
Spinoza's
and you find
quote.
But you find it is in Spinoza, but you also find it in Vanini, and he was killed in like 1619, I think, and he wrote he had that phrase, and he used that very phrase, God or nature, in a book he wrote. He got killed for that book in early 1600s.
A lot of people got killed in this history, and when we say unorthodox. When we say unorthodox, it's unorthodox relative to the dominant structure that came to obtain power, which in the West was Christianity and for a long time Catholic Christianity. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
And with the pantheism thing was quite a thing for a while. Even in the early 1600s, you had people writing against it. You had Catholic sort of apologists writing books saying that this is what the enemies believe, pantheism stuff. So that's like half a century before Spinoza's even writing anything. But then with Spinoza, just that idea just explodes outwards.
Right.
And especially with books like Three Impostors, and I mean it's like a fake version of the Three. Yeah, I mean there's I translated two versions of that, and they're both like just using the name, writing their own ideas. They're communicating their own thing, but it's they're just slapping that name on.
The Three Impostors was a book that was kind of like famous and infamous.
Legendary.
They kind of made fun of Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses, right?
Yeah. It was just a legendary, like, this is the ultimate atheist book, and but so basically people just created their own versions of it, and that's what the versions of it you can find, like the books you can find with that name or these pseudepigrapha.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's the pseudo. Sorry.
Do you think that Spinoza is better classified a pantheist or an atheist?
Oh, he's just a theist in his mind. He would hate. I mean, he didn't like to be called those things, as far as I recall. Atheist. Almost, I don't know of any atheists who's into this sort of literature who doesn't appreciate him as a forerunner or we like him on our team, but he himself wouldn't have. I don't think he would have considered that too much.
He wouldn't have. He wouldn't have, but he had an idea of God that was so different.
Yeah,
it was basically the laws of the universe.
Yeah. So, I think what he does is he takes he just says, look, if you take seriously the way you theists describe the classic sort of God as the infinite being, well, what is that? What else does that mean except basically a pantheist? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you'll have like for example, I mentioned Philip Blom. He basically says Spinoza prayed God out of existence, and there really is no father figure to pray to that does anything. Jonathan Israel is another scholar who thinks Spinoza was very important and basically looks at him as kind of an atheist. And Spinozism was considered atheism, Spinoza's doctrines all through the subsequent centuries after him. So
yeah. Oh yeah, he was huge influence on the kind of Yeah, I mean, yeah, I
Right.
don't dispute anything that Jonathan Israel said. That whole clandestine literature is just really, really strongly.
Well, let's get into atheism. You could qualify some of the ancient Greeks as kind of pantheist, atheist, Democritus, Lucretius, some of the pre-Socratics, some of the cynics like Antisthenes and some others. But you have a book about, you call him the first atheist, a guy named
Oh,
Matthias Knudsen,
Knudsen.
spelled
Yes,
Knutzen. I never
yeah,
heard of him. Can you tell me about him?
yes. It's kind of just marketing the title. He's the first. He is the first person to explicitly identify himself and write a book. Publish anything. He's a very mysterious guy. Kind of the late 1600s, 1660s, I think. Remember, I got the book back here. But he basically went around from university. He was like a student, I think he was a theology student, and he wandered around sort of northern Germany. He's from northern Germany, but he wandered down into Germany, uh, kind of Leipzig, or he went to the University of Jena and a few areas around here. He'd published up 3 different pamphlets, just saying, uh, "Here's a new sect that I founded. I got followers all over the place. We do not believe in God. We reject all authority." He's like an anarchist, explicit atheist, and he's claiming to have all these followers in the different universities. And what he does is he goes to the different places, and he just he sneaks into the church and puts these all over. He puts a bunch of these things all over the church. I guess hoping to get some people to read them, and he just wandered around giving out these little pamphlets. And he's using his own name, telling his history and stuff, and he just vanishes. There's just one book about him that was written by sort of a professor at the University of Jena in Germany, and he kind of tried to follow up all the information, and he gathered all the information he could about him, that's but the guy just kind of disappears. So who knows what happened?
Yeah. Tell me a little bit
Um,
about.
but yeah,
I
that's
think
him.
we have a little bit of a
That's just,
delay. Yeah. Tell me a
oh,
little
sorry.
bit about John Meslier, the atheist priest who left his book My Testament behind.
Yes, so so this is in the early 1700s. He's just off in a very rural, I guess, parish out in the corner of France, northeast corner of France. When he writes this, he just basically he's in a bind. He doesn't. He's completely atheist. He doesn't. Uh, he but I guess he just kind of wants to keep quiet and doesn't want to end up dead like anyone else.
Right.
Like if anyone would do publishing what he was writing. But he basically sat there uh, writing all night, and he wrote this huge book, just uh, just sort of debunking Christianity top to bottom, and theism altogether. And then he leaves it, and when he dies, he just sort of he sends out a few copies to keep, so it can't be easily destroyed. And yes, so yeah, just sort of he just said he tried to just do the best he could as a priest, like not teaching him the stuff he didn't believe in, but
Right.
trying to manage it.
But tell me about Dobach and Diderot and their circle. Dobach had a salon where all kinds of famous people, intellectuals came for like 2 or 3 decades. He published the System of Nature, which is a phenomenon. Tell me about them, and who are some of the atheists in that group.
So Diderot, yeah, he's yeah, I'm actually thinking of your earlier video with Andrew Curran on him.
You saw that?
Yeah, it was really good. So so I mean, Diderot's it's hard to say that in a few words what he was. He's just basically generally a writer and an intellectual that tried to spread the Enlightenment through the encyclopedia, and but he had a lot of, like, he was probably one of the more impressive in the group, in kind of the kind of canon of famous atheists through history. He's one of the better writers and more, he's an art critic and far more readable in that than quite a lot of them. But he held, with these famous salons. They had, I couldn't even put me on the spot naming all of his friends. But I know another good one is Nagion, because he edited, I think, a lot of the stuff that we end up with. One thing that's interesting with these guys is that all this stuff that's been circulating just in manuscript form among sort of wealthy people in their private libraries, these guys are actually publishing it for the first time in the late 1700s. One thing about Diderot that I think is unfortunate, though, is that he, as far as sort of the atheists and sort of free thinking and radical enlightenment and stuff, is that which is discussed a bit in at the end of one of Jonathan Israel's books, is that he really took a strong kind of cynical stand against Lemaitre, who they just saw him as like, you're too like, that he was just too honest and too sort of radical. So he in a way, they kind of threw him under the bus, Lemaitre, especially after he died. They just all said he was just a horrible person and the worst kind of thing.
He supposedly he was a doctor, right? And he got really fat, and he supposedly died from eating too much or poisoning or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, he's possibly, I think a lot of the jokes about him were possibly true, like the victim of his own medicine.
They consider Lemaitre kind of amoral, like he was amoral. Why did they consider him so amoral? I haven't read a lot of Lemaitre's work. I read about it, but why did they see him as such an amoral guy?
There might be more to the story, because I know that in general, I think just the general thing is just that, like, well, he says in his books that he kind of espouses like a pretty open-headedism. You should follow your passions and stuff, and I don't think he ever says anything like to. I mean, he's just trying to think of some of his. He works out a kind of a decent ethics in one or two of his books, but it seems like he might have left his wife and kids at one. There's one letter he's written that I put out a book. Has it? There's quite a bit in that one about him. It's kind of a whole bunch of hazardous materialist. It's called.
I've seen that book. Yeah,
he's. As far as what he advocates, I don't think there's any problem with it. But he might have had some problems some personal stuff that they knew about. This, because I do trust Diderot as a pretty good judge of character with like Rousseau, the stuff he knew about Rousseau, and
yeah. Well, Lemaitre, he had an important book called Man and Machine, basically, where he was really talking about man just being a natural machine. Speaking of Diderot, he thought of natural selection 100 years before Darwin, right? And he thought of genetic manipulation and DNA before they were discovered by centuries. He even the Oedipus complex, Freud read him. From what I've read, Sigmund Freud read him and kind of got a lot from him, because he kind of in the book Rameau's nephew has this amoral guy Rameau talk about how really cynical. He's kind of like testing his own higher standards and ethics and ideas, putting them through the scrutiny basically. But Rameau says, like if we were left to our own devices, we would all like have sex with our parents or something like that. And then kind of like, yeah, that sounds like Freud, some of his psychosexual theories.
Yeah, it's a little fear of what might happen if you it was pushed down. Yeah, you always keep everything repressed. Yeah, yeah.
Go
ahead. No.
Well, I was going to ask you specifically about this book, The Skeptic's Walk by Diderot.
Sure.
Can you tell me kind of the story of this book? I think it got discovered and never published. Tell me what's in it, like, because it's one of my favorite books by him.
Oh, really?
So if you could just.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's okay. It's a few years since I worked on that, but he was imprisoned for his first book, Philosophical Thoughts, and if I don't have the story wrong, he wrote that while he was in jail, and
I thought it was Letter on the Blind that he got in prison for.
He was in jail several times.
Oh wow. Okay.
Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, when the Philosophical Thoughts came out, I included a letter in my translation of that at the beginning. It was actually not a letter; it was a decree of the Parliament of Paris that the book should be burned. They didn't know who wrote it, and the book the book was to get shredded and by the public executioner. Like that's what's going to happen to the author if we catch you. He was in jail, but I don't want to say the story wrong, but he had he wrote Skeptic's Walk, and it was confiscated. Eventually, the manuscript, I don't think he ever saw the manuscript again, but it came back to the family. It was published. It wasn't published until like 1920, long after his death.
Right.
And
well, it's kind of the book where he becomes. It was published before Letter on the Blind. It was like his second book.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the book where he transitions to being an atheist.
I don't know. I think he's still, because he has a character called Atheos in there, and I think he's sort of making fun of him.
But one of his he has like a Spinozist, pantheist, atheist, and like the amoral Lametri atheist, then a theist or deist. And reading Jonathan Israel, he says that the Spinozist wins, and that's just kind of like his transition book where he becomes mainly an atheist.
Right. I'll have to go back and reread it. Yeah, definitely.
If you have the book Enlightenment Contested by Israel, that's where I think he discusses it in that book.
Okay. Yeah, I have to read it. I'm always looking at. I need to always find time to revise.
The other book that I have here, New Liberties in Thought, Du Marseilles. So this was like kind of a really early manuscript that kept floating around that was popular, that had kind of like a group of atheist writings in it. Can you tell me about that briefly? Yeah.
So that's there's actually a body of like the scholars have more than 200 manuscripts that they've identified from this sort of body of texts that are floating around in people's just getting hand copied, and they're too dangerous to publish, so they're just floating around.
Okay.
Sorry, we froze there. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's basically this body of text that are floating around and unpublished, but it's all like developing Spinozism and materialism and all of that. And basically that book is basically they've grabbed it like 5 or so texts from that huge body of work, and they've just grabbed a couple of them and put them together. It's actually written by people like Fontenelle, who's a very, very famous person at the time, without his permission or his name. I think there's one in there where he'd written I mean, he was a very famous guy at the time, very well respected, and also at the same time very atheistic. Yeah, I mean that the one the book of his in there is on freedom, and it's very deterministic text. There's one called The Philosopher in there that's a really great, just sort of a manifesto for the sort of Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Person, ethics.
Segueing into materialism and determinism.
Okay.
It's not, you don't necessarily have to be an atheist to be a determinist and materialist, and vice versa. How much were determinism and atheism linked to? I mean, determinism and materialism linked to atheism. Like, were there, and that history, were there atheists that were not materialists and determinists? Because I know you have like Thomas Jefferson, who was a materialist and talked about, if God and angels and the soul and all that, if they are not material, then they don't exist, right? And that's kind of weird to me. Jefferson, obviously, he was anti-religious. He didn't believe in any of the stories of the Bible and all of that. But he was a materialist that was not an atheist. But so how much were those two mixed up? That determinism and atheism.
These whole things can all go together because I mean I grew up as a Mormon and they're materialist. So my whole life I've been a materialist, and not very told very explicitly that they believe in Mormons believe in only there's no such. I mean that's a very explicit doctrine of theirs. That there's no immaterial soul. It's all material. But so that and I know that lots of religions have been certain Calvinisms and Islam can be determinist.
Yeah, Calvinism is deterministic.
Yeah, without being atheist at all, because it just God created everything and put it in motion. If you look at Voltaire, I find his deism really sort of agreeable. He because his God is almost doesn't do almost anything. It's all and it's a very there's a book he wrote called it's something like You Must Pick a Side or something like that. It's in one of my books on him, Voltaire's. But he in that book he might as well be. There's just this hair's difference between what he espouses there and you want to. Determinism, it seems to be is. I mean, I think most materialists would be just by default you end up being a determinist because the universe is atoms moving around. That's obviously you should be able to trace if you knew all the causes. You could. I think it's in that. There's a statement really similar to this. There's a statement very close to in that New Liberties on Thought book. I think it's in that Fontenelle essay on freedom where he says basically that there's no. Well, it's the kind of thing that convinced me on determinism just calling myself that, to the effect of if everything has a cause. So if everything has a cause, just that by default that's determinism.
Right. Yeah, Diderot seems to be like he was a determinist, but not a completely determinist. So he left some room for chance and human agency to an extent. It's from what I've read. So.
Yeah. There's Spinoza's.
Think about the quantum level, right? In science, that it might be deterministic, but it appears to be largely chance, right? Obviously, we don't have a grand unified theory to combine relativity and quantum physics yet, but
at the same time, all of your these sort of Enlightenment era materialists, they're very happy with chance being involved in the deterministic systems that they have. So, yeah. I mean, you can. I mean, there's 1,000 different ways to reconcile freedom with determinant with a deterministic out. Like the big picture is deterministic, but you don't know what's going to happen, so you might as well.
Right.
It doesn't really make a difference what you call it.
Yeah. So
reality is.
right. So I know you said you read my blog, Atheist
Oh yeah.
Before Darwin. So we do have people like Richard Dawkins talking about, he couldn't imagine being an atheist before Darwin, and there seems to be kind of be a general sense of that. But there was this long tradition of people, some of which were very important, that were atheists. And some of this goes back to antiquity. They had ideas of evolution in antiquity. There's ideas of, like I said, Diderot lays out natural selection to me pretty clearly, and like 3 books, and Letter on the Blind, and D'Alembert's Dream, and something interpretation on nature in the 1750s. Even Lucretius has kind of evolutionary ideas. So
yeah, there's Lemaitre puts out he doesn't have evolution. It's his book System of Epicurus. He puts out a different theory for people to just kind of the land sort of something being in the mud and people being able to just sort of immerse. It made me think of like Lord of the Rings, where they kind of pull the orcs out of the mud or something like that.
Of course, people were speculating, but people were looking. The point is, people were looking at nature and they were thinking maybe things evolved, maybe things started, bottom up instead of top down. And obviously Darwin, and we had Lamarck before him, and Erasmus too. They were scientists, not just philosophizing, speculating. But yeah, of course, Darwin did he discovered kind of the main mechanism. We didn't really discover. He discovered it physically, and he gathered all the evidence for natural selection. And obviously, since then, everything's corroborated it from all confluence of fields.
Yeah.
So yeah, but let's get into briefly communism, the history of communism. I've heard Christianity was a communist. I've heard many people say that. What do you think about that? What is kind of the brief history there?
Yeah, that's well, I mean, my take. It goes back mostly to something like in the sort of Western tradition. It goes back to Plato mostly, if not.
Republic.
Yeah, and then mostly it goes through Christianity, through the Middle Ages. The kind of secular version of communism, I think you can kind of see it with some people in the Enlightenment time. There was a priest kind of similar in some ways to Méliès, who is called Dom des Champs. He was a Benedictine monk, and he actually tried to get Diderot to kind of promote his ideas. He shared his book with Diderot actually, and Diderot called it. I think he called it the most violent book he'd ever read, or something like that. But he was a priest, a monk called Dom des Champs, which is the religious title. But he was religious, but his conception of God was basically pantheistic, and but yeah, so that's like the 1760s, I think, when he's writing. So but he didn't have a lot of followers after he died, after he stopped writing, anyways. And it really, you don't get another secular. Oh, to be honest, going back, Méliès has a certain kind of communism. It's kind of like a small local scale type thing that he's advocating, not like Marxist world take over the world. So they're just individual thinkers throughout the Enlightenment. That's one thing that with Steven Pinker's book, when he was promoting that book, The Enlightenment Now, but I think during some interviews I heard him saying that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't care about equality, there
Pinker
were
said
quite
that?
a lot. Yeah, it was in some, I think some interview he
I
did
don't
on
think
BBC.
I don't think Pinker said that.
It was,
I've read that
yeah,
book. That's the
yeah,
book is called Enlightenment Now. I mean, he's championing the Enlightenment, saying we
yeah,
need an
yeah,
Enlightenment now, right?
yeah, yeah. But
Not all
not
of
to
the
get,
Enlightenment, but a lot of it was.
yeah. No, it's nothing against him at all. It's or it just, but just the point I was trying to get to here is that the Enlightenment had quite a lot of individual kind of thinkers. But like your more, I mean, your Diderot's and Bill Box are a lot more conservative politically. Because like Bill Bach, he wrote quite a lot of politics. It's pretty much just classic. It's just kind of in the liberal tradition.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, they were definitely hesitant about revolution, right? But they were they also, you know, they were and Diderot got to the point he was anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism.
yeah,
They were always anti-slavery. They were all about, from what I've read, all about rights, and in a lot of ways were very radical, and that's why they were part of the radical Enlightenment. And Israel groups all of them as at the front and the core of the democratic Republican part of the Enlightenment. And
yeah,
I'd say summing the Enlightenment up, basically, the Enlightenment was when people said, you know, this world is not fallen, we're not all damned, and we can make this world better. We can use human knowledge to better this world and better individual people's lives. You know, and they did it by, you know, holding up science, philosophy, being evidence based, challenging necessarily the dogma and the tyranny of religion and the churches and the state. And So in the Enlightenment, most of the Enlightenment figures were not religious and they were not Christian. Even somebody like Rousseau in the Social Contract talks about, he basically puts down Christianity,
yeah,
even though he was very much a deist. And you say the same for Voltaire. Voltaire. There was like one or two times he seemed a little agnostic, but he was definitely a deist. You know, but he obviously could not stand Christianity, and he had campaigns against it. Yeah. So like John Locke, I guess he was like a very liberal for his time Christian, but most of the figures of the Enlightenment are anti-Christian and anti-religion, or at least they were not religious, right? And then there was a stream of atheists and that route.
yeah,
So.
yeah. At the same time, I'm just thinking of in Germany, most of the Enlightenment figures at least had were nominally within the church and working within, tried to work within their institutions, and like, I mean, say like Lessing through Kant, Leibniz, all these guys tried to bring I think they just were trying to bring that inside their religion and say, well, you can do a rational version of it all, a rational Christianity, you know,
Right.
you can have a reasonable religion.
Yeah.
And I think there was more of that
around, you know. Yeah.
I was gonna say there's a lot.
But when you look around,
yeah.
Taylor, I am on a podcast. Sorry about that.
No, I got you.
Yeah. So, you know, we have David Hume, we have Adam Smith, we had Dolbach, Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, Toland, Collins, Nagion. We had the guy that started the Illuminati. What was his name? Weishaupt.
Yeah.
Yeah. And many I'm not even thinking of at this second. They were all non-religious and often irreligious, and some of them were atheists.
Oh yeah.
It seems to me like the majority of all the figures I can think of were not religious and oftentimes anti-religious. I think you could throw in Edward Gibbon, you know, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Um, and obviously a lot of the American founders like Franklin, Jefferson, Payne, um, even
Yeah.
people like Thomas Young and Ethan Allen, who wrote Reason, the Only Oracle of
Reason.
Man, things
Yeah.
like that. So
Yeah. I think it's good. It's useful to group them like Jonathan Israel does into the moderate. I think the ones I'm talking about were more the moderate Enlightenment, and then
yeah, he makes that divide. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
But as he says, the Enlightenment is the foundation where we get all of, or the vast majority of the good parts of modernity that make us, better than the past by any, rational or fair standard.
Yeah.
Tolerance, keeping religion out of the government, religious tolerance, freedom of speech, press, equality for sexual equality, racial equality.
Yeah.
And there were some differences in the Enlightenment, obviously, but that's the overall, it's about ameliorating mankind and the idea that we can make things better in this world. And that we need to use knowledge, science, clear thinking to do it. And it was cosmopolitan too. It was all about connecting the world. And it was at a time when we were realizing there were other cultures that survived for millennia without Christianity and they were fine. Things of that nature. And we did have some things like colonialism that happened. Slavery, you can't blame that on the Enlightenment. That's the time when we started getting arguments against those things, and slavery existed for forever. So,
yeah, that's the powers that be were directing that stuff.
Yeah, that makes me so angry though. These people that are, I don't even know who they are really, but I hear about them that are anti-Enlightenment. They apparently have, published books trying to attack the Enlightenment. So many people pointed out it's the reason, the thing is where we get everything good in modernity. So
there was a whole sort of genre of writings going back to the 1920s, directly going after all of these. Basically, yeah. In France, they're just called anti-philosophes. So,
right.
But that genre goes back as far as, in fact, as far as atheism specifically, the word, you have sort of writings against atheism a long time before you have anyone actually writing books in favor of actually being able to publish them.
Of course, Romanticism was kind of an immediate reaction to the Enlightenment. One of the books I'm reading right now behind me by what's his name? Something Ritchie. I forget the author's name, but it's The Enlightenment, the Pursuit, or the Pursuit of Happiness. It was not all about reason and rationality. It was also about happiness, figuring how we can be happy. That was a key thing too.
Yeah,
Diderot and the Radical Enlightenment pointed this out too, that it's not just about reason. It's about, Diderot talked about the passions, that, and including erotic passion. It's that, that matters a lot, and reason helps us steer things, but a reason alone can't motivate us to necessarily do something.
Well, that's a lot of what the romantic, in my understanding, is just incorporating the emotions back into that. What they see is, at least in Germany, they're seeing it as too cold, and they need to have the emotions, which I was already part of it with Diderot and all the way in Diderot's very first book. Is, I think it's almost the first line in that book. People always run down the passions, but that's all your happiness is also based on the passions.
Nancy, can you close that curtain, please? It's too much light. Sorry.
So yeah, it was, and that's a lot of what Lemaitre was. A lot of his writings. It's all about, passion, emotion, just happiness from the bodily pleasures, and so the kind of the cold rational side of things, it's only a small part. I mean, I would say that's a lot of that.
I'd say they're equal part. They're two sides. We need both to steer things. Correctly.
A lot of it's Spinoza coming from Descartes, but Spinoza himself isn't that rational. He's quite happy for you to have aspect.
Of course, one of the things that people use to attack the Enlightenment is the French Revolution, right?
Oh
But
yeah,
look at how it was founded in the documents, the rights of man and all of that. Very modern. It really, you look at the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, that is echoes it. I mean, and the American Revolution. So what we got is like Robespierre, right? And the Reign of Terror. Robespierre, by the way, was an anti-atheist.
yeah, yeah,
And a lot of those guys that were part of the terror, they were big Rousseau fans, right? Very big
yeah,
into Rousseau. Not so much Diderot and Dolbach, and they had a lot of influence too, but like kind of on the more noble, good, more calmer, rational part of the revolution when it started, right?
yeah. It's hard to find a lot of advocacy, or really any advocacy of like a violent overthrow of the government. And there's a few things. There is actually a poem Diderot wrote, but you're not going to blame the terror on a poem. He wrote a really good book. He wrote a poem called the Eleutheromanians, however you want to put that, where it's quite violent.
Yeah.
But in general, they don't write like how to overthrow the government or anything. I think that's more circumstances. And there's a lot of I find less agreeable thinkers later in the kind of in the late 1700s and during the revolution that I find are kind of
I remember
advocacy.
Macron, the prime minister of France, talking about after, I think it was after the some teacher got beheaded or something, talking about, we're the country of enlightenment, these ideas, these secular values of, cosmopolitanism, tolerance, liberty, I'd say the Enlightenment still has so many enemies, but it's also the foundation of modernity, and it, to a large extent, has succeeded in transforming the world. So, can we get into briefly before we wrap up anarchism?
Sure.
You want to tell me about that?
Yeah. Well, I think my main contribution to that area would be that I think that discovering, putting out the works of those writings by and about Matthias Knudsen, I think that's an interesting starting point.
Right.
He's like you wouldn't name any. You couldn't find any anarchist who even know that guy's name. But
Yeah, I didn't know it.
he says very explicitly, we reject all magistrates. He says that in two different books, two different ones of the pamphlet. He uses a phrase like they drive the magistrates out of this world or something like that. So that was funny. But yeah, so but yeah, I mean, there's no tradition going out from him. So I mean, he's just a flash in the pan in that way. I mean, that kind of there's a lot of you could probably point to Sylvain Maréchal, who's an atheist writer during the French Revolution time, as a kind of an early anarchist. There's a few other ones during the French Revolution.
Yeah.
And then
Mikhail Bakunin, or he's the one that also an anarchist.
There's a few different. I mean, the phrase starts being used during the French Revolution to describe certain tendencies and enemies of the official revolution. But
right.
And then the term gets picked up and used sort of positively by Proudhon, and then even slightly before him, you have it with a guy called Anselm Bellegarrigue, and I translated his early books. He's writing around the same time as early Proudhon.
Right.
And he uses that. He I think he originates the phrase "anarchy with order," so that's a slogan. But yeah, I've just done a few of those things.
I'm gonna break myself.
I just find that interesting. And
No, you're always wrong.
but yeah,
I told
yeah.
you. Idiot.
Kind of lost my train of thought on anarchism. I'm working on a couple. There's a couple of really interesting guys in the early 20th century that I'm working on that are anarchists.
One,
Okay.
two,
I would love if you could do a translation of those letters from Diderot to Sophie Voland.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think we should get those in English.
I own.
I dig them up. My criterion usually to work on is whether if there's a edition it's not too expensive available. like because like with Méliès, that's a huge book, and that was
Less.
that it's like massive. I got that book down to that size just by making the print very small. It's annoying, but at least it does cost you $50. But there's it basically.
Maybe you should just start to speak French.
What's that? Yeah, yeah.
The next language I would want to learn is French, so maybe I should just start with that.
Yeah, well, what I'm working on is Latin now. There's quite a lot of the stuff that I'm gonna read. Early Enlightenment is only in Latin, and there's a huge.
No, I'm doing this again. I'm sorry.
There's this book. It's called the Theophrastus Redivivus. I'm not going to do this. But
that's big. Yeah, that's huge.
This is the first real atheist book in Western history. 1650s.
What's it called again?
Right, because they're always wrong. You
So
say you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong.
Theophrastus Redivivus.
Hold it closer. Okay, cool.
So, this is it says it's stuff in Italian here, but it's in Latin.
Right.
And there's no modern language translation ever been published. It's only in Latin.
Excellent.
So, but there's that's just one example. There's a bunch of other ones.
Yeah.
Can
you shut up?
So there's so yeah, there's just too much out there to do. A lot of it.
Okay, well, excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you're doing the work you're doing. I think it's really cool. I wouldn't have been able to read a few different books if you had those translations. So yeah, I hopefully you keep it up and get those Diderot and Sophie Voland letters and some other stuff.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining me.
Of course.
Yeah, it's been fun. All right, we'll speak to you later. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Just have a good one. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.